All right, good evening. We'll go ahead and get started by setting our motivation. So, just on your own, take a moment to reflect on your interest in the topic, what you're hoping to learn, and particularly think about how what you might learn could be used to be of benefit to others. Try to expand your motivation and widen your circle of concern, and think that the purpose of your time is to try to find ideas and tools, techniques that you can begin to put into practice to tap into your potential. And by tapping into your potential, using those new capacities to work more and more effectively for the benefit of others. Try to think along those lines. All right. So I feel like it's always important to preface classes with the disclaimer that the goal is to discuss ideas that come from the realized masters like Lama Zopa Rinpoche for this class, and this is, I think, particularly important for today's material, to state very clearly that my goal and the goal of the class is to present Lama Zopa Rinpoche's ideas and realizations, and to think about them, and that I'm also learning and thinking about them just as much, and that that although I'm reciting or shining a light on these ideas, they aren't my ideas, and I don't have these realizations, and so this is just as difficult and kind of mind-blowing to me as it probably is to you, trying to wrap your head around these ideas. And particularly, I mentioned last time how that's kind of Lama Zopa Rinpoche's style, is this incredibly direct and intense way of presenting, just kind of not pulling any punches, and kind of really showing us our own minds, and showing us the tendencies and the habits in our minds that aren't serving us very well, and what we can actually do. And so the last two classes, and this is a 5-week series, in the last two, because you may be starting to think about, well, okay, we're talking about bodhicitta, but how, and kind of we talked a lot about the prerequisites last time, and developing the aspiration, how to develop the aspiration. But you're probably at some point going to wonder what actually is involved in causing it to arise in our own mind directly, rather than just kind of creating the ground for it to arise. And so to say the last two classes in the series is when that will kind of come into play. What are the actual methods that generate bodhicitta in a person's mind. But again, of course, assuming that their mind is prepared for that realization by having generated renunciation and all of the things that we're also talking about. So we do have to get there in a stepwise fashion, which is kind of the whole presentation of the Lam Rim, the stages of the path to enlightenment, because we said that bodhicitta, the realization of bodhicitta, is what's called a great scope realization. So it very much does depend on being successful in the contemplations of the small scope and the middle scope. But we will discuss the actual method for cultivating it, the actual steps that are involved, the direct steps also. So yeah, so I just, of course, wanted to say that I'm not presenting these ideas from, yes, Barbara.
I didn't want to interrupt you, Venerable. I was wondering, I was looking for I wasn't able to attend the first class, and I was looking to see if it was on YouTube, and I didn't see it.
No.
Will it be there?
It should be. Let me check. Because I thought I did see it. Right, good. Let's see. I'll just pop it in the chat. There you go.
Thank you. Was it in the Thupten Norbu Ling's YouTube? Oh, it was. Okay. I just guess I missed it. Thank you.
Okay. So, yeah. Any other questions before we get started? All right. So we mainly covered chapter 1 last week. Today we're mainly going to cover chapter 2, where Lama Zopa is really going to go into how, in a way, kind of the inner transformative power of bodhicitta, the realization of bodhicitta, its relationship to enlightenment, and I think its role kind of in the Mahayana path, because of course we've said that it's a great scope realization, but also we know that, or you've probably attended teachings where, regardless of the level of the teaching, they start with the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. So he'll talk about also the role of trying, even though we don't have the actual meditative realization of bodhicitta, we can also think of it as a motivation, as separate from actually having spontaneous bodhicitta. We can think about effortful bodhicitta. We can think about kind of on the basis of understanding the benefits of bodhicitta and the power of bodhicitta, trying to just assert it as a motivation, and how even how powerful that is in ripening our minds and helping us to progress along the path. So he's really going to present this motivation as being, in a way, not just this abstract end of the path meditative goal that none of us have accomplished, but rather something that we can take even right now as the heart of not just our spiritual lives, but our whole life. Because ultimately, Buddhism, would say very clearly that we shouldn't think about, with regard to any part of our quote unquote formal spiritual lives, we shouldn't think of it as something separate or something other than daily life. Something like, well, for this 45 minutes, I'm doing my spiritual work, and then for the other 23 hours and 15, then I'm just doing whatever I want. It doesn't matter. I'm not incorporating anything. It's totally a different thing. Of course, it's like that, for us in the beginning to some degree, but we're really meant to try to narrow that gap as much as we can. And what Lama Zopa is going to talk about here is how we can think about motivation as being really one of the prime ways of accomplishing that, regardless of what the activity is. We don't have to say that and really it isn't true. What he's going to point out is that it isn't true if we think, or if we say that there's some basket of activity that's holy or that's spiritual, and then there's some other basket of activity that isn't holy or spiritual. It is entirely dependent on the mind that we approach that activity with. That mind can in some ways diminish what could otherwise be a very powerful, beneficial activity. And that mind can also elevate what would otherwise be a very mundane, and, kind of even, maybe mundane is the best word, but just kind of an extremely ordinary activity like eating or drinking or looking at nature. We're also hosting a series of classes, which I encourage people to check out, by Geshe Zopa, not Lama Zopa, Geshe Zopa. He is teaching also on the Bodhisattva vows. He's done 2 of those, and they're on the YouTube channel. The other 4 will be in June, because he's having to do some travel. But he was talking really powerfully and beautifully last night about really kind of what I was saying, that we'll get to kind of the end of the class, the end of this series on cultivating bodhicitta, where he was saying, we can see in everything that we do, we can see the role that our parents played. We can see, that but for the kindness of our parents, this wouldn't be possible, no matter what, no matter whether it's a mundane activity or a holy activity. Again, those baskets of activity have no kind of power from their own side, but whatever the activity is, we can see the role of, and it was, in a way, it was kind of like the sort of thing that Thich Nhat Hanh, always says about interdependence, and so we can be reminded of those things in any activity that we do. So that's so I would encourage people to check out those 2 recordings, and then hopefully you could join also in June when he comes back. Yeah. So what we'll see then is that it's the motivation that we go into an activity with that is the primary determinant of what we get out of that activity. And we can't say, to some degree, Lama Zopa says, well, there are certain things that maybe have power, some limited power from their own side, like maybe mantra, carries some blessing. And certainly they would say, viewing a holy object or visualizing the Buddha carries some blessing. But if while we're doing that, we're corrupting it with wanting others to see us as a holy practitioner or something, then yes, there's still maybe, due to the power of the object, some blessing, but also the mind is really corrupting that experience in ways that a more pure motivation would actually be able to elevate, very strongly. Okay. So here he's going to talk about, and a lot of this idea of motivation is in the context of adopting, because what we're trying to do, of course, what the whole Buddhist path is trying to get us to do is adopt new ways of perceiving, new ways of prioritizing, and new ways of taking information in and making decisions about it, which means that the ways in which we're doing that now could use some refinement. That, obviously, if we already had perfect view, perfect motivation, then there wouldn't be further to go. But we all do have further to go. And one way of starting to move in that direction is to try to realize that this kind of hedonistic hamster wheel, that we're on, isn't new. That if we accept, or at least if we take, as Venerable Urbina says, kind of take as our working hypothesis the idea that the mind is beginningless and endless, then we've had innumerable lifetimes in a variety of circumstances. And so, we've had the pleasures of kings and queens and so on, and, titans of industry. But what Lama Zopa points out is that, we just can't remember that. And so I didn't excerpt that here, but he kind of makes that point in the book that, if we actually could remember, oh, I spent 50 years, climbing this corporate ladder, and then I spent, if we just sort of accept that our bodies are like healthy and young the whole time, just as a way of eliminating the suffering of aging and sickness, if we had perfect recall of all of these accomplishments, we would become, disenchanted with them much more easily. But unfortunately, we don't have that recall. So, but we can kind of establish it through logic and through reasoning if we are willing to look at the idea that the mind is beginningless and endless, and therefore by extension, there is no height that we haven't reached within ordinary cyclic existence. And Buddhism would say not just once, but countless times. And we have a limited, we do have some experience in this life that we can draw on as kind of a microcosm of that. The problem is that it is a limited slice, and we are kind of convinced that if we can just expand that slice, then it will work. That we can see, from our own direct experience in this life, we can see that the more limited range of happiness and dissatisfaction that we have experienced has never really been truly, sustainably content or free from suffering. But we can see, in our world, that there's a wider range. And so we have to contend with the drive to kind of just think, well, if I can accomplish that wider range, because I haven't done that, then things will be different. But, we can also look at the people who have done that, and we can see that they're not free of suffering. Bruce Willis, has hundreds of millions of dollars, but he's also experiencing, really intense physical suffering now. And he's kind of lost some of that continuity of capacity, and that's going to be his experience, for probably the rest of his life. So he's powerless, to have that experience. And we can look at the rates of depression and suicide and how they're, to some degree, relatively high, among and alcohol abuse and substance abuse. And in one way, it could be that those people, because they kind of have done, according to this normal view, they kind of have done a lot of the things that we are holding out hope have the answers, but they've actually been able to demonstrate more directly, more so in their own experience, that still those don't have the answers, that still the dissatisfaction is there. And so really, in a way, they're even less fortunate, because ignorance in a way is kind of bliss, for people who haven't actually demonstrated that to themselves. Buddhism would, of course, not encourage us to try to waste time demonstrating that to ourselves. But I think we can look at the world and we can see lots of evidence, even without resorting to the idea of past and future lives. And we can just extend what we can see to this wider perspective and see that the only thing that we haven't actually done is put an end to suffering itself. The only thing that in any of our past lives we haven't done is to achieve full enlightenment. And so, of course, bodhicitta is a critical step in that process. So, but Buddhism would say we probably have developed bodhicitta before, but we haven't joined it with direct non-conceptual realization of the nature of reality. But that's not really the topic of this class. But. So again, here now he's going to say that even renunciation, even recognizing that we suffer, and we've suffered beginninglessly, and if we don't move in a different direction, we'll continue to experience unsatisfactory conditions endlessly. He's saying even that recognition isn't sufficient, because that's really just another form of happiness. That's really just another form of seeking happiness for oneself, even if it's the happiness of nirvana, even if it's a really stable happiness that could last for, because as we talked about in the first class, from the Mahayana perspective, nirvana itself isn't of course, it's certainly not the highest possible goal, but it's also not a state that is fully self-sustaining, in the sense that enlightened beings can still reach nirvanic beings and can still exhort nirvanic beings to finish the path to enlightenment. So, it isn't, we're not even really free from that kind of prodding. We're not even really free. It isn't as if we can escape, that even that kind of wisdom prodding that from the enlightened beings, we're still subject to that, even if we achieve nirvana. So all we're really doing is delaying. It would be one thing perhaps if we could say, well, if we achieve nirvana, then at least nobody will bother us ever again. Like, at least it really is fully isolated, fully self-sustaining, bliss, that has no end. But that's not even true, because the enlightened beings have access to that realm, and motivated by great love and great compassion, they they will exhort those beings to complete the path. They will try to help those beings to see that there's still yet further that can be accomplished. And then when that happens, those beings would see that they kind of wasted so much time in pursuing this path that isn't even itself kind of self-generating, self-sustaining, that they would then, motivated by that exhortation, they would then leave that state and engage in further training. So what we said last time was that we might as well just decide that further training is the goal that we'll adopt from the beginning, that we won't go down that side street. We'll just say, well, this end goal is my end goal from day one, and I will only go in that one direction. Because again, the thing that is true about a nirvanic being, and the reason that the Buddhas exhort them to continue, is because to the extent that they do remain in that state, they're not of benefit to others while staying in that state. They can't affect any other sentient being while remaining in that state. And here Lama Zopa is saying that we shouldn't just, that any sentient being, even animals, are looking out for their own pleasure, their own happiness, their own freedom from suffering. And we as humans, should try to have a more noble purpose, a more useful purpose. And that purpose should be to dedicate our lives to work for the benefit of others. And the enlightened state is simply the highest possible perfected capacity that we can access to be able to bring that to fruition, to bring that goal, that motivation to fruition. Because that's really the only, certainly nirvana, lower nirvana, is quite, they describe it, as quite peaceful, quite contented, but also cut off and isolated from ordinary beings. And so all of that time that one spends there isn't being spent helping to ripen the minds of ordinary sentient beings, to guide them to a state beyond suffering. Whereas the enlightened beings also are completely free of their own suffering, completely contented, completely blissful, but they do have the capacity, because the subtle obscurations to omniscience have also been wiped away from their minds. They not only have the benefits of the nirvanic beings, but they can also emanate back into cyclic existence. So they are not separated from ordinary sentient beings. They can use that state actively to work for the benefit of others. So, but here, of course, what Lama Zopa is saying is that the biggest, and here, this is where I was saying that he really, he has the courage to directly address and to show us our own minds, and to show us what our own obstacles are to achieving these goals. Out of great love and great compassion, the enlightened beings, will show us our own minds to help us to see what kinds of obstacles are there, so that we can practice and get rid of them. And ultimately, what he'll point out is that this comes down to the selfish mind. This comes down to kind of choosing immediate sources of self-gratification, kind of the easiest. And, we talked about last week, we talked about how this is completely ordinary. This isn't talking about, well, good people are like this and bad people are like this. It's not trying to talk in these moralistic terms. It's really kind of just talking about the path of least resistance and how we're born, kind of with certain drives, certain, we seek comfort, we seek safety, we seek food and shelter, and then over time, of course, it becomes refined and more conceptual, and we also seek reputation and status. But really, they're kind of just all means to safety. They're all means of comfort, means of soothing the mind, just like, chocolate and just like ice cream. And, they're just sort of these immediate things that we do that distract and soothe and pacify the mind. And he's saying that tendency is our greatest obstacle to cultivating the mind of bodhicitta, because with that mind, we will continue to try to make cyclic existence work. We will continue to think that there's some set of outer conditions that I don't possess, and because I don't possess them, I suffer. And if I did possess them, I would at least suffer less, or maybe there's some sort of hypothetical grouping of, like, if I was a billionaire, if I was, then I wouldn't suffer hardly at all. But that's just not true. We can demonstrate countless people, and even if they don't necessarily know it, even if we can see how Buddhism would say that we can learn to see the suffering of the way that they approach the world, maybe because they've become more callous, or they've become more greedy, or so the ways in which that pursuit has affected their mind in negative ways and caused them to develop tendencies, to feed the parts of the mind that we also have. Again, it's not moralistic. We also have envy. We also have greed, but we may not have been able to feed it as consistently and as successfully. But of course, it isn't to say that we're better than someone, but when certain causes and conditions come together, certain mental states might meet with resources, or they might meet with adoration, or and then it can kind of snowball in ways when, we don't have millions of people, going to our concerts, or, writing news articles about us. And so the seeds of jealousy and envy and greed, and, they're not being watered right now in this life in the same way. But we can recognize, well, if that did happen, if they were being watered like that for me, I'd also probably be, just have the same megalomaniac sort of tendencies of whoever we might think acts that way. And it's just the coming together of the causes and the conditions that are reinforcing those tendencies. But ultimately, it's the same. We talked last week about the mind of self-grasping and the mind of self-cherishing. Self-grasping is the mind that looks at what are called the aggregates, looks at the body, the body and the mind, and how they seem to be connected, and how our identity seems to stop at our flesh, um, and then how that identity appears to the mind in a hallucinated way to be so solid, so real, and set up from its own side. Whereas really what you have is an incredibly complex, interdependent web of different causes and conditions that don't have that kind of intrinsic, inherent, solid reality. But on the basis of that hallucinated sense of solidity, we then cherish that identity as being more important than other people, and other, because when I have a headache, I have to do, I'll do whatever it takes right now to get rid of that headache. But if somebody else has a headache, I may commiserate, with them, but then I'm going to go back to, the thing I was working on, or, I won't necessarily drive 20 minutes, to do something about it, but I would absolutely do that if it was my own suffering. And of course, for our children or for our spouse, there's, but, for our next door neighbor, for someone that we felt like was rude to us, there's no chance that we would have that same level of concern. And again, that goes back to the egoistic lens that we use to create all of our experiences. Any thoughts or questions so far? Reflections? No. So this is also, of course, getting at the need to overcome. This is not directly referenced, but there's a phrase called insensitivity to Dharma. Dharma meaning the collected teachings of the Buddha, the means of inner transformation. There's a kind of a phenomenon, a tendency, when if things only remain academic, if things, the things that we're studying or learning, if we don't actually practice them, if we don't actually try to integrate them into our direct experiences, then that we can develop what's called insensitivity to Dharma, which means that it just kind of stays as a surface level understanding. It just kind of, we know what the 4 of this is and the 8 of those, and we know the names of the lineage lamas, and but we haven't actually tried to use that wisdom in our daily life to solve problems, to change how we relate to others. And so the wisdom, the knowledge is just purely academic and intellectual. We haven't actually reduced the egoistic mind. We haven't actually used that wisdom to confront and argue against the mind of egoistic self-concern. And he says, that purely academic level, doesn't have much power to move us in the direction of being able to develop bodhicitta. So here he's saying, kind of with bodhicitta, our potential is limitless, because sentient beings, are nearly infinite, and if we take responsibility, bodhicitta is the wish to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, to bring all sentient beings into the state of enlightenment also. That's the highest way of benefiting them. And so, because sentient beings are numberless, then the potential of our own mind is equal, to that which is unfathomable. Because, when we think of sentient beings, mostly we think of, the people in our state, the people that we kind of have seen driving around. We can kind of think about the people in our country, if we kind of think about it. But it's hard to think about, right now in this moment, there's people doing stuff in Africa, there's people doing stuff in Australia, there's people doing stuff in Asia and Europe. And, simultaneously, there's 8 or 9 billion people all right now living different lives, having different experiences. Just that, is really hard to get a sense of. And then there's trillions of other sentient beings on the earth. If we look at, of course, the mammals, but then you have the insects, of which, and then you have all of the sea creatures. So just the insects, there's like millions of insects for every human on earth. So when we think, and that from the Buddhist perspective, that's just one planet, in one kind of realm of existence. There's other realms of there's whole other realms of existence. There's trillions of other planets. The idea of all sentient beings, when we say enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings, it's not all Americans, it's not all humans, it's not all beings on earth, it's all beings in every realm of existence. And so that's what we mean by, numberless or limitless. And so the benefit, the merit of thinking in that way is just the power of that. If you really try to spend some time contemplating what all sentient beings really means, and then saying that you will take responsibility for freeing all sentient beings from suffering and install all sentient beings in a state of perfect happiness, perfect contentment. That's why it's called, immeasurable. When we talk about the 4 immeasurable, thoughts, that and that's just love and compassion. That's just, generating love and compassion toward all sentient beings. Here, bodhicitta is further than that. Bodhicitta uses love and compassion as the foundation, but it actually goes further, and it says, that I myself, by myself alone, will free all sentient beings from suffering. Yeah, Barbara. You're still muted.
What you were just talking about, that's where it gets really overwhelming for me. It's one thing I can wrap my head around, wishing happiness and freedom from suffering for all beings. That's where I can wrap my head around. And then what you went on to explain, just again, that then becomes overwhelming for me.
Yeah. And I think too, of course, that this is a stepwise process, that, that each successive step is helping us to get, to put the pieces of the puzzle together. but it certainly is, and I think, but I think it's overwhelming in a good way, overwhelming in a, because we see the potential of our mind, because it's not like we're the first sentient being to achieve enlightenment. Many sentient beings have achieved enlightenment independence upon developing bodhicitta. And so, but then there's like the always, they talk about the always crying bodhisattva, that particular, who was so overwhelmed, by the suffering of sentient beings that, he was just constantly moved. So it is something that is meant to move our minds. We are meant to, respond to it, not just, to respond to it viscerally, to respond to it. But then, like he's saying here, that doesn't mean that when we talk about responsibility, we're not taking responsibility for the actions, the negative actions of other people. We're taking responsibility for the content of our own mind. We're taking responsibility for the fact that if I have hatred in my mind, then I will harm sentient beings. If I have love and compassion in my mind, I will benefit sentient beings. So that's the kind of level of responsibility. It's not to say, if we can try to help, change conditions in the world, that's great. We can try to do that. But ultimately, we can't take responsibility for the hatred that someone else has in their mind. But we can say, well, the content of my mind is my responsibility. And that is what I bring to all of my interactions with other sentient beings. And so by developing my potential, then I stop harming sentient beings, and I start to be of greater and greater benefit to them. But yeah, I mean, I think that, and again, no one is saying, of course, we're meant to have a sense of urgency. We're meant to, Lama Zopa even says to try to think of it as unbearable, that sentient beings are suffering and that we can't fully, fix it right now, that it's kind of outside of because we haven't developed the ability to kind of really influence things in a more direct or a more forceful way. We should use that as fuel along the path to think that I must, I have to. So, there certainly is a real visceral kind of, because the Buddhist has to practice like your hair's on fire, that kind of that kind of sense that it's intolerable, that kind mother sentient beings are experiencing samsara, and we don't have the tools, to kind of, in the same way that when people look at like the war in Ukraine and, or the tsunami that, 15 years ago or whatever it was that killed, 500,000 people. When we look at these things and, we think, well, what can I do? But we think that we should do something. And, we were moved to try to help in some way. And this is just kind of looking at it in a deeper way, where we understand that there are these deep karmic, factors that are in play, and that really it isn't one particular manifestation of these karmic forces that, of course, to whatever extent we can be of benefit in response to that one karmic manifestation, we should do whatever we can. But there's this deeper system in play, and it's the whole system that is responsible for these individual karmic manifestations of suffering. And only undermining the whole system will work. Only, removing the whole samsaric process, it will ultimately be effective. But luckily that's possible. If none of this was possible, then it would all be pointless to think about. If it was just overwhelming and there wasn't a way forward, then it would be silly. What would be the point in trying to contemplate it? But we do have the capacity to ripen our own mind and achieve the state of enlightenment, and then work for the benefit of others. And but even then, of course, there's many enlightened beings right now, and yet suffering still persists because there aren't enough. There aren't. And like what John Landau taught a few weeks ago, and he made the point that one reason is that different sentient beings, because there's so many sentient beings, that any one sentient being has a somewhat limited number of karmic, close karmic connections. And those close karmic connections, like if you look at the story of the Buddha, the people in India that he actually directly was able to teach were all like people that he had these in the Jataka tales, and in other, like he had these close karmic relationships with in previous lives, and they were his first kind of circle of direct disciples. And then of course we can say that we too must have some karmic connection, because we're born on the planet that he also manifested on, and his teachings still exist. So of course there is still some karmic connection, but the people that he was immediately able, because if you read the sutras, people were, just by hearing one word from the Buddha, they were getting realizations, and they were becoming arhats and all kinds of things, left and right during, in the sutras, which is very unusual. But it was because of the power of their karmic connection with that particular sentient being. And we have karmic connections, with our parents, our, friends, our loved, and from, the last couple of hundred lives or so, you could say. And so those sentient beings are the ones that are going to also be, like when we achieve enlightenment, they will be among our first circle of disciples, that we will be able to most directly benefit. And without that, they, yes, maybe some other sentient being will achieve enlightenment, but they won't have that. And so our loved ones will be suffering for even longer, because that kind of looser karmic connection. So that's why they're kind of depending on us to get, to perfect our own minds, so that due to the power of our karmic connections, we can be of benefit to them. And of course, all sentient beings too, but it may take, but for a certain grouping, it may take even longer, because they have to wait even more. Okay, so again, so here Lama Zopa also goes into this, like kind of what I said, where this phrase, this idea of responsibility, comes down to the content of our mind, and so the likelihood that we will harm sentient beings or the likelihood that we will help sentient beings is dependent upon the work that we are intentionally doing to cultivate love and compassion, or our willingness to feed hatred and intolerance and those kind of more destructive states. If that's what we cultivate, then that's what sentient beings will get from us. And so that, to that degree, to that extent, we have to take responsibility for the content of our mind, and then think, it's kind of like with great power comes great responsibility. We can see how when those negative seeds are watered, like Putin, Putin's not different than us. He has jealousy and hatred, and just like we do, but he also has nuclear weapons, and he also has an army, and we don't. And so when his mind met with those conditions, great ruin for millions of other humans came into being. And then then we see His Holiness the Dalai Lama, whose mind is also not different than ours, but it met with other causes and conditions, and millions of sentient beings benefit from that. And so it's like, what we have to choose. We do have the power to choose. We have the power to, in every moment, make decisions, which of those pathways we go down, which of those tendencies we feed, with the understanding that in the, if not this life, in the future, we will be someone like Putin, or like His Holiness, or like, Desmond Tutu, or, like, these great, Thomas Aquinas, and, these great masters, great people. Not all, don't have to be Buddhist, but their minds met with certain causes and conditions and great benefit, came from that for countless sentient beings. So that's the idea of responsibility, is like, which it's not causeless, it's not, and it's not outside of my control. There are things that right now I find very difficult. There are things that right now I struggle mightily with. Not, yes, me individually, but yes, also all sentient beings. But that doesn't mean that it's completely outside of conscious control. It just means that we have to put effort into that path. We have to start with the understanding that it is my responsibility, because I'm interdependent with all sentient beings, and because sentient beings will meet with harm if I don't, and sentient beings will meet with conducive circumstances if I do, then there's no choice. I have to go down the right path and not the wrong path. So again, this is Lama Zopa being really direct and trying to show us how to think about changing our minds. Because we, as ordinary sentient beings, we're caught up in the 8 worldly concerns of praise and power and reputation and wealth and comfort, status, all of these things. But he's saying that the purpose of life is just to be useful to others. And being the state of enlightenment, again, is just the most useful state. It's just the tool that has the greatest power, has the greatest ability to benefit others. But here he's saying, just to have this attitude of being of benefit, of being useful, transforms everything that we do. So then he's saying, even if we hear that, we might die from something, our mind won't be disturbed. We will use that as a way of understanding the suffering of all sentient beings. Realizing that it isn't just, that, yes, maybe I get a cancer diagnosis, or I get a heart disease diagnosis, or an Alzheimer's diagnosis, but countless other sentient beings are also in that same state. So we use that to generate compassion for all sentient beings. We use that to open the heart, rather than seeing that through the lens of the ego, which is, just going to think about not wanting this to be happening to me. We'll use that to see that countless sentient beings are experiencing that kind of suffering, or even worse suffering than that. And they are experiencing it in lifetime after lifetime after lifetime. And so, just like the Buddha, when he's, was motivated to go forth into homelessness, it was to find a solution to sickness, aging, and death. So our own association with sickness, aging, and death can also play the same role. It can also help us to recognize that, when I see my own aging, or when I'm sick, or when I'm facing my own death, then it isn't just me facing that. It's the existential condition of all sentient beings facing that. And so I need to find a solution to that. And the solution is the same solution that the Buddha found, which is to achieve one's own enlightenment, and then to bring all sentient beings into the state of enlightenment. So then Lama Zopa goes into a little discussion of the prayer of refuge and bodhicitta, which I've alluded to earlier, that it's customary in Buddhism. It's common to all Mahayana traditions to recite the refuge prayer by itself is common to all traditions. The bodhicitta, that aspect of it is not common to all Buddhist traditions, but it's common to all Mahayana traditions, because the lower schools, or the lower the Theravada tradition doesn't have bodhicitta. But so this is one. There's a couple different English translations of the refuge prayer, the refuge and bodhicitta prayer. I go for refuge until I am enlightened to the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Supreme Assembly. By my merit of giving and other perfections, may I become a Buddha in order to benefit all sentient beings. So here he's saying that even if we don't, that it's such an incredible, he's going to really, suggest that we recite this, even because he says, even if we don't fully understand all of the meaning, that it's so powerful, it moves the mind. And we've talked a bit about in Venerable Urbina's classes, the How to Meditate series, about this idea of motivation and how we set up our sessions, and how, if we do a prayer like this at the beginning, then even if we feel like, the session, we were distracted, or it didn't go very well, or, we had a lot of negativity arising. Still, we set the motivation to be this incredibly vast, beneficial action of doing it on the basis of refuge and bodhicitta. So it really doesn't matter, what comes after, because the motivation is so powerful. And so, again, it's the field that this motivation is in relation to is numberless, is every sentient being in every realm of existence. And the state that we are aspiring to is also the highest, most exalted possible state. It isn't saying, may I become a heart surgeon? If we could say, well, that's a great, it's a great aspiration to dedicate one's life to becoming a really great heart surgeon to alleviate the suffering. But still, for one, that field is only human beings who have heart disease. So you're talking about, a few 100 million people, several hundred, hundreds of millions of people, I guess. But then how many of them are you going to directly come into contact with, over the course of your career? Maybe a couple thousand. So, and that's wonderful. How extraordinary is that? That's a wonderful kind of way of motivating and dedicating one's life. But this is literally every sentient being in the form realm, the formless realm, the desire realm, the bardo. It's so much more intense than that. So he's going to give a little bit of commentary on the prayer. So he's going to talk a bit about this idea of refuge. Refuge, of course, is a huge topic, and there are certainly books just about refuge and whole courses that you could take just on refuge. The Discovering Buddhism 2-year program has a module on refuge. But we can say, in short, refuge is done on the basis of what's called fear and faith. And so that's the basis of it, is recognizing, and here, of course, fear is kind of what we would call a wisdom fear, rather than a neurotic fear. A wisdom fear is, I'm going to die, and I might die without ever having practiced. Whereas a neurotic fear is, I'm going to die, because that's true, but there's nothing we can do about that. What we can do is not die without having practice. What we can do is, use our life to whatever time we have left, and to whatever degree we can use our life constructively. That is within our power. Even if we only have one day left, we can use that one day constructively. But just being fearful of death itself is a neurotic fear, because nothing can be done about that. But we develop a wisdom fear about the dangers of cyclic existence. And we use that to motivate us to act constructively. So it isn't a neurotic fear, it's a wisdom fear. And then on the basis of that wisdom fear, understanding the pitfalls, the dangers of cyclic existence, we then think about, well, where do I turn? What do I turn to? And we recognize that the Buddha and his teachings and the community of practitioners who've realized his teachings are where we ought to turn. The Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. Sangha here was the same phrase as Supreme Assembly in the previous way of talking about that. They mean the same thing. With respect to the refuge jewel, these terms refer to people who've directly perceived the nature of reality. So we use the word Sangha in different ways. It sometimes is used wrongly in a really colloquial way to just mean a community of practitioners. The more correct conventional way of using it is a community of monks or nuns. But in terms of when we're talking about the refuge jewel, we're not talking about monks and nuns specifically. They're kind of the conventional Sangha. But the real Sangha, the ultimate Sangha, is anyone, whether they are a monk or a nun. Of course, the value of seeing monks and nuns is the power of the vows and aspiring to the vows and that sort of thing. But the refuge jewel, the ultimate refuge jewel, are those who've directly seen the nature of reality, because they are the people on our planet who are most primed to be able to benefit us. Just someone just taking vows, maybe they may have no realizations, and so they may not, they're certainly aspiring to something, they're certainly trying, and that's that can be a useful role model in that way, but they can't necessarily give us high quality practice advice, and because they haven't seen the nature of reality directly. So we're really trying to, in terms of who we take refuge in, ultimately we take refuge in people who've seen the nature of reality directly, because they really do have the capacity to give us really good quality advice, really the best kind of guidance, apart from enlightened beings. So that's where we, on the basis of that wisdom fear, we turn toward the Buddha, the Dharma, and the Sangha. And then what Lama Zopa points out, is that this is also based in compassion, that it isn't only directed at seeing fear and then wanting to be free of fear. We also recognize that all other sentient beings are subject. We use our own fears, just like we use our own sufferings, as a window into understanding what all other sentient beings are facing. And then, just like we wish oneself to be free of that, we also wish others to be free of it. And then again, we go even further in terms of bodhicitta, because again, refuge and bodhicitta prayer, the bodhicitta aspect of that requires that we go even further than just wishing for sentient beings to be free of suffering and to have happiness, but we actually have to take responsibility for bringing that about. We actually have to say, I'm not going to just wait for someone to do it. I myself will be the one who does it. I myself will take responsibility for the content of my own mind, and I will develop the realization of bodhicitta to be the person who does this for sentient beings, rather than just like saying, oh, wouldn't it be great if my neighbor did this for all sentient beings? That would be like, that's really what no, I will do it, even if I have to do it by myself. Oh, whoops. So then this next excerpt, it was a bit long, so I have to provide some additional context here because I didn't want to excerpt the whole thing. Here he's again talking about motivation. and talking about how there are no intrinsically holy activities, because he's talking about there's an example in the Lam Rim about 4 people who are engaging in what outwardly looks like a holy activity of reciting a prayer. And what he's saying is that the first person recites the prayer with a bodhicitta motivation. So before they engaged in the recitation, they really set up a very clear intention for why they were doing it, what their purpose was. And it was to achieve enlightenment for the benefit of all sentient beings. And then the understanding is that because that was the motivation, what they then did, that action, became a cause for that person to achieve enlightenment. It kind of joined the karmic and energetic force that would create the causes and the conditions for that to manifest in the future. And then he's saying another person recited the same prayer, but their motivation was to achieve complete renunciation and therefore liberation from suffering. And what is pointed out is that for this person, that is the cause that it took, that the same prayer, the same energy, it took on that kind of karmic force, that when that karma ripens, it will join with that kind of similar karma to create the causes and the conditions for that person's mind to develop renunciation and freedom, and on the basis of that, freedom from all suffering, which means nirvana. But it will not become a cause for full enlightenment. It will become a cause for lower nirvana, but not for full enlightenment, because it was not motivated for in that way. And then the third person recites the prayer thinking that it will ripen in future lives to provide them with conducive circumstances. So reputation and status and wealth and comfort and, the kind of worldly happiness of future lives. And then what is said here is that the same prayer for this third person does take on that kind of karmic power, that when it ripens, those sorts of causes and conditions will come into fruition, but not liberation nor full enlightenment, only. So we can see, and then there was a fourth person who that I didn't excerpt because it was quite long, but there's a fourth example of someone who wanted the prayer to ripen just to improve the conditions of that same lifetime. So to maybe extend their life, or to provide them with resources between that moment and the time that they died. And then it could have the power. What they say is that it's more difficult to create karmas that ripen in the same lifetime, but it certainly is possible. So if that karma was to ripen, it would ripen in that way. And what Lama Zopa says is that these 3 motivations are considered dharmic or Buddhist motivations because all of them are directed at future lives. Whereas the motivation of this fourth person that I didn't excerpt, that's not even a Buddhist or dharmic motivation, because it's just directed at the happiness of this life. So all of these are kind of considered at least valid motivations, but you can see, because we do need good future lives. Without good future lives, we won't have the necessary causes and conditions to practice. We need to have food and status, and they serve some useful purpose. And then, of course, we also need renunciation, but the highest, of course, is enlightenment. So what he's, again, encouraging us is that we should try to infuse everything with bodhicitta motivation, because then, karmically speaking, it will join with that force. And when that karma ripens, it will become part of the energy that leads a person, that gives us whatever we need for full enlightenment, whatever, it may ripen as resources, it may ripen as a particular geographic, a location where there are a lot of teachers, or there's a lot of respect for the teachings, or something like that. But whatever is needed to achieve that result karmically will be kind of part of that energy, because that's how it was motivated for. So this is just really talking about why it's so important to try to assert a bodhicitta motivation. Again, even if we don't really, even, of course, not thinking about it as a meditative realization that, well, some people possess and I don't possess, and therefore, like, I just have to wait until I do possess it. We can start to think about it, of course, as a direct meditative realization that we are trying to cultivate, but also just through the power of aspiration, just through the power of recognizing its benefits, and wanting to be like the people who have developed it, thinking of it like that. And, Lama Zopa says, as he said before, just saying the words, even if we don't fully understand it, has some power. It will move the mind in the right direction. Any thoughts or questions? So the next topic is, lots of questions. Barbara, let's start.
You had talked about when we say the refuge prayer, how powerful it is in moving our mind, even if we don't completely understand it. Is that how mantras are as well? Not, saying mantras and not really understanding exactly what they mean. They also move the mind in that way?
Yeah, there's some, because a mantra is understood to be, it's Sanskrit, and Sanskrit is a kind of very intentional language of resonance. And so there's some understanding that the sort of resonant frequency of mantra plays a role in the subtle energy system of the body and mind. But they also talk about sort of the transmission, the lineage of, receiving the mantra from your teacher and having confidence in its, in its purpose, and how it's kind of not the mantra itself, but because again, everything comes from the mind. So it isn't so much the mantra itself, but really one's confidence in the mantra. There are stories in various sutras about people who technically weren't reciting a mantra, according to the actual Sanskrit syllables, where they misheard it, but they had so much devotion and faith because they received the mantra from their teacher, and they were told about its benefits, and that it was a really effective mantra for them, even though maybe they weren't actually pronouncing it the way it was meant. And probably for us as Westerners, we're not going to pronounce it correctly either, because we can't hear all of the nuance, and our mouth and tongues don't do the kinds of things that they should do to be able to pronounce really subtle. So that's quite good that, it isn't so much getting everything technically perfect, but it's about having confidence in the power of the mantra. But I mean, yeah, everything is, and then also kind of gets into kind of a different thing, but like through, like when we do puja and we try to do these visualizations of divine pride and clear appearance, and, trying to see all of that is, it's kind of imaginary, but it's very powerful, when we try to see others as enlightened, and we try to see the environment as pure. It's through the power of the mind that we manifest in that way. So kind of the whole resultant vehicle of Buddhism, of Vajrayana, in that way, is the power of the mind, and not, yeah. Susan.
Venerable, how did you define Sangha again? Not the conventional way, monks and nuns, and not the other, I'm not sure if you said conventional way, just a group of people in the environment, that particular environment. But do you mean all sentient beings in the world? Is a more accurate way to see it?
No, so in terms of the refuge jewel of Sangha, it is those practitioners that have directly seen the nature of reality, who've seen emptiness directly in meditation. So at that moment, they become part of the refuge jewel, because they are no longer trapped in the same kind of mistakes and misconceptions that ordinary beings are. So another word is the, arhats, or superiors, those who've directly perceived the nature of reality. That's the more technical, in terms of refuge jewel. That's who we actually take refuge in.
But how is that determined that they have experienced that?
It's a meditative realization, and not having accomplished it, I can't, at that point, a person only perceives emptiness directly in meditative equipoise. So when they come out of it, they still, but so you couldn't really determine it from the outside. With any meditative realization, you really can't look at a person or interview without clairvoyance. There isn't a way of verifying or checking from the outside that a person has a direct realization of anything, impermanence or death or karma, any of the realizations. Internally for that person, when they observe phenomena, they might, when they look at a computer, they would see a computer just like we do, but they would understand in a very deep, very intuitive level that computer wasn't something that was outside broadcasting some essence to them as a subjective awareness and saying, I am a computer. Whereas we don't have that. We can kind of get there a little bit when we really think about it. We can think, well, there are keys and there's a top and a bottom and there's internals and there's a screen, and if I shave a little bit here and I shave a little bit there and I put a dent, then it's still it's still a computer from, I still perceive it in the same way, but it's changed. So how could it be, if it's changed now, how could it still be what it is? And at what point, like if I take out one key, it's still a computer, but if I take out like half the keys, probably it's not really a computer anymore because I can't really use it as a computer. If one key works like 90% of the time, then it's still a computer. But if, 30 keys work only 5% of the time, not really a computer. So we can kind of get there, but then every time we look at it, it's just like computer from its own side is sort of, it's as if the computer is in the nature of being a computer from its own side that has nothing to do with the causes and the conditions, the parts, has nothing to do with labeling, on those causes and conditions, some kind of, word or thought. So because we don't have that meditative realization, we get very caught up in things. We get very wrapped up in the appearance of things. Whereas someone who has had that meditative realization, the appearance of things is still pretty similar, but they don't believe, they don't buy into it in the same way, the same deep, they don't get mired and stuck in the same way. They have a very light, very loose, way of navigating, because they've seen in meditative equipoise, they've seen that things appear to have intrinsic existence, but in fact, they don't. That in fact, there is only the coming together of causes and conditions that's holding some kind of temporary karmic manifestation in that moment, but it's changing in subtle ways, moment by moment by moment. And therefore, there's no solid, findable, real essence. And so that I would assume that would really, intrinsically, fundamentally transform how they internally are relating to everything that they're experiencing. But you can't test, you can't test for that. It's a deeply personal kind of thing. But that's the kind of person that you want to ask questions of and get advice from and get guidance from, because they know something so fundamental that you don't know, and they're so much more clear-eyed about things than you are, than I am, than we are. And that's why they are a valid source of refuge, because of their meditative realization. So yeah, we don't really have time for, I'll just maybe spend a minute and we'll wrap up. So this is again he's going back to this idea of responsibility, and he's kind of saying, again, this goes back to the idea of, well, if there is nothing that could be done, then we might as well not think about it. But our minds are not stuck as they are right now. Our minds can be transformed into the minds of fully enlightened beings. But that's true of even ants and dogs and cats. Their mind is also in the nature of clear light, but they can't meditate. They can't read. They can't study. They can't do anything to really activate that potential. And there's, as we said, most of the sentient beings on just this planet are insects and sea creatures, and and then even in the human realm, there's so many people under really difficult circumstances, wars and famines and disease, and they, maybe their mind is very clear, and if they had, but they don't have food, they don't have clean water, their whole day is spent just trying to survive. And so really dedicating themselves to a spiritual path, in a deep, consistent way is quite difficult. So we also have to think about this idea of responsibility in terms of how incredibly fortunate we are to have all of the inner and outer conditions to activate this potential, because the potential is there, but it is shared even with fleas and dogs and cats. But activating it, really tapping into it, requires a very special coming together of causes and conditions. And that has happened in our lives. And so we must take advantage of that coming together and not let it go to waste, because it's so incredibly rare within samsaric existence as a whole, that coming together of causes and conditions almost never happens. And yet for us, it is happening. And that gives us the responsibility to use that wisely, to use that well, to not throw that opportunity away. So that's another way of thinking about responsibility. Okay, so as I said, we are out of time. I've gone over time, so I will finish up. And yeah, so let's just dedicate. So dedication is very similar to motivation. Motivation happens first, dedication happens after. So let's think whatever positive energy we've created, we offer it for the benefit of others. We think, may it ripen in whatever way is beneficial for sentient beings. May it serve as a cause and condition for the flourishing of bodhicitta in our minds, in the minds of all sentient beings. May it pacify conflict, disease, poverty, any harmful conditions in the world. May it ripen the minds of sentient beings and allow for the state of enlightenment to arise in the minds of all sentient beings. So think along those lines and just offer your time and your energy for the benefit of others. Okay. So we've got 3 more classes. All right. Any other questions, thoughts? All right. Well, thanks for coming. And yeah, hope to see everybody again next week.